everyone got a glass of wine or a drink or so Steve is going to join us, but we think he's trapped on the conference floor somewhere. But he's floating at the minute, okay. So he'll catch us up. We'll just start in the meantime. So we're just going to start Europe Talks, which is one of our big projects, relaunches on Friday for 2021. So we're just going to watch a little trailer about last year's Europe Talks.
Hello, my name is Roberto.
Hi, Roberto. How's it going?
So my name is Rachel.
My name is Sarah.
Good evening.
We've made it at last.
Did you feel like your hospital was overwhelmed and you couldn't cope with it?
Well, the epidemic started on the last week of February. We admitted the first 2 patients on the 22nd of February with a very severe pneumonia. We saw so many patients suffering simultaneously that we thought it was an apocalypse.
Like, I found ICU so stressful, just the alarms, patients on ventilators. I found it all really upsetting. I qualified a year and a half ago. Even for a very experienced doctor, it was really overwhelming.
Well, now we are in the second wave. We learn a lot about organization and also about treatment.
In that period in the hospital, like, say if I'd ever call someone, so if I call radiology and say, I'd like to request an x-ray, I would really feel the urge to, at the end of every phone call, say, I love you, but like, I was obviously just really emotional and like stressed out, but it was this very heightened emotion.
We choose to be a doctor, so it means that we choose to help suffering people. And in that sense, we felt unvulnerable, even though the situation was very terrific.
I was 19 on D-Day. How old were you then when you were in the army?
I was 17 years old. I have the war 4 years with the Germans. I was prisoner. I wounded. Op een landmijn. It's not so bad, not so good. I go from England, from Liverpool by boat for 1,000 Dutch boys go to Indonesia. Yeah.
I was supposed to go to Japan, but the Japanese heard I was coming.
Yeah.
So they surrendered.
Yeah.
I was sent out to Egypt. When I came back from there, I came home a day earlier than expected. I rang the doorbell, and my mother opened the door and said, "Can I help you?" She didn't know who I was, didn't recognize me. I was very, very brown. But there you are. And that was the end of the war for me.
Nee, corona is echt is very difficult here.
It's the only thing that's affected the whole world. We're all on one side of this, and we can't see it. The Germans, you could see, or the Japanese, you could see. You knew what you were fighting. But here, you don't know.
I like to dance. Yeah, at ballroom with a girlfriend. Yes. Yeah. I do the quick step, Engelse waltz, the tango, the rumba, cha-cha-cha.
I used to do the Viennese waltz. It's the only dance I could do. Twirling round and round.
Okay, yeah.
But that was a long time ago. I don't do that anymore.
I'm pretty sure Madrid is the capital city of Spain. I live in Birmingham.
I went there every summer, and that's to improve my English and stuff. I had to go to the doctor. They did all these weird tests, and they looked at me and they said I had coronavirus. It was really weird, and it was very horrible because I had to have all these antibiotics and stuff.
I think I was more lucky because I never really exactly got sick.
But I also got very depressed because it was 3 months of not being able to go out. The only reason I could go out for is my dad. Sometimes he let me, to take the rubbish out with him.
I think I was more on the luckier side because nearby there's a community center, and they let kind of like a toy library. So they had board games for each age, so you could play with your siblings. You could also borrow books as well, so they had a library as well.
I don't know any English food, any particular English food.
Because usually you would have fish and chips.
Oh yeah, I had fish and chips. Yeah, they're yum. They're really delicious.
Well, I don't exactly eat too much English food because my parents are Chinese, so I usually eat like rice.
The only thing I know a bit about Japanese food, like sushi and stuff. I don't know anymore.
Bye, Roberta. Thank you for sharing your experience.
Ciao, Shannon. Bye bye.
Ciao.
Very nice meeting you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
So it was really nice to meet you. I hope I see you again and stuff.
It was really fun meeting you, especially someone who lives in Spain. And yeah, bye.
See you all then in a corona-free world.
So that's our Project Europe Talk. Some of you might know about Britain Talks, which is a project we've been running for the last 3 or 4 years, getting Brexiteers and Remainers to have conversations together, and people divided by other things, intergenerational divide as well. So Europe Talks is as a way of expanding that, and this year we've got even more kind of interesting countries taking part. So if you want to sign up, you basically have a Zoom conversation with somebody in a different country about whatever subjects you like, just for an hour. And I mean, I have to say that I've found it one of the most moving things that I've been involved with. Like last December, we were just sort of entering the end of the EU transitions sort of time, and we were, right about to disembark kind of from Europe, and those conversations took place. We thought nobody would sign up, but there was something like 15,000 Brits who signed up and said they'd have these conversations. And the overwhelming feedback was that people found them really moving. Like they expected people to be angry with them and new, and people were just saying, "Oh, we're just a bit sad that you're going." Actually, so they just had really good conversations. So anyway, so I urge everyone to sign up to that. I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for coming today, and particularly to Unite for having us. We historically worked with Unite on loads and loads of different campaigns, and it really sort of makes a difference in terms of making the campaigns more powerful and more rooted in people's experience. And Unite have done a lot to encourage people to sign up to our Britain Talks programmes as well. On Friday, we're launching Europe Talks again. We're carrying on with Britain Talks, and Britain Talks is challenging kind of even to us really to take part in. To escape our own bubble, we actually have to partner with our comrades at the Daily Express, which is challenging for us to get involved. But that's how we get a whole range of different people holding discussions, and otherwise we just end up within our own mirror bubble, which is a bubble like any other. So I think that sidestepping the culture wars and being able to genuinely talk to each other is one of the greatest challenges of our movement, because how can we end child poverty? How can we solve the climate crisis if we can't even talk to each other? And I think that we know deep down that these culture wars are kind of being deliberately stoked by people who want us sort of running around in circles instead of actually noticing what's happening to our country. And it's no coincidence that the algorithms of surveillance capitalism want to push us deeper and deeper into these silos, the culture wars as well as culture wars, as we sometimes think about them. Polarisation is paralysing for our progress as progressives. I think that's something I fundamentally believe. And I remember talking last year about how we're all reduced at the end to a kind of jar of angry wasps stinging each other instead of kind of going out into the world. And this year I spent Friday in Brighton A&E after a bee stung me, so I can attest to the fact that it's a very very pointless way to carry on. So many of us here, and especially on this panel, have a connection to Joe Cox. And many of us remember the terrible sense in the weeks kind of leading up to her murder that our country had entered these very deep tunnels of division from which we couldn't see a way out. And I think I wanted to say that Joe for someone who knew the way out. And since her death, I think that some of us have tried to follow the chalk markings that she's left behind, and that's something that kind of unites probably quite a few people who are here today. So today's been pretty much about gathering together some really varied people, all of whom I just massively admire because I think they're trying to do things differently. If we just keep doing things the same way again and again, you know, it's the definition of madness. And basically we can't win alone, so we've got to kind of work together and broaden our movement. So first of all, I'm going to introduce Ozlem Cekic. Did I do that right? I've practiced it so many times I'm useless. He's come all the way from Denmark to be here today. Ozlem is the founder of Dialogue Coffee and the author of Overcoming Hate through Dialogue. I first discovered her through an amazing TED talk that she did that I'd really encourage people to have a look at. Ozlem was the first Muslim MP elected to the Danish Parliament, and initially she deleted the flood of kind of hate-filled emails and death threats that followed her election. But then she decided to take the risk of replying to some of those people and to hold a conversation with them. By meeting and engaging in dialogue over coffee, she discovered it was possible to create change in the people that were contacting her. And she also found her own ideas about herself challenged. That to me is the absolute definition of bravery, to go meet someone who said that they was key. So anyway, Ozlem, tell us why you did that and what you learned in the process.
Okay.
Can you do this one?
Yeah, I can use this. Thank you for the invitation. In 2007, I was elected to the Danish Parliament, and I clearly remember that the first speech I gave, and I can clearly remember finding 2 emails in my inbox afterwards. The first one asked, "What's the terrorists like you're doing in our parliament?" And the second one used words like "racket" and "whore." So I stopped reading them and deleted them. But they weren't the last hate mails I received. I was born in Turkey from Kurdish parents, and we moved to Denmark when I was a young child. In 2007, I ran for a seat in the Danish Parliament as one of the first women with minority background. I was elected, but I soon found out that not everyone was happy about it. So I had quickly to get used to finding hate messages in my inbox. I never answered the emails. I just deleted them because I thought that the senders and I had nothing in common. They didn't understand me, and I didn't understand them. Then one day, one of my colleagues in the parliament said that I should save the hate mails because when something happens to you, it'll give the police a lead, she said. So I noticed that she said when something happens and not if something happens. So sometimes hateful letters were also sent to my home address. The more I became involved in public debate, the more hate mails and threats I received. After a while, I got a secret address, and I had to take extra precautions to protect my family. Then in 2010, a Nazi began to arrest me. This was a man who had attacked Muslim women on the street. One day, my son asked, "Why does he hate you, Mom, so much when he doesn't even know you?" So I answered that some people are just stupid. And actually, at the time, I think it was a pretty clever answer. So one day, my friend suggested I should visit them. But I didn't understand what will be the point of visiting them. And he said, "So you can confirm your own racism." But I didn't understand him all because I wasn't a racist. In 2010, I decided to follow my friend's advice, and I started answering the hate mails and suggested to the center that we should meet for a coffee and a chat. And since then, I have had hundreds of encounters. And they told me that they have taught me something important that I want to share with you. Let me take you on my journey. As a young girl, I hated different population groups, and at the times my religious views were very extreme. When I was a little girl, I saw photos of dead Palestinian children, and I hated Jews. girl started at my school. One day I was sitting in the playground when she asked me if I wanted to play basketball. So my first thought was, I can't play when I'm Jewish, when I'm a friend of the Palestinians. But I played with her anyway, and I also said yes when she invited me to lunch. And to my surprise, I could eat everything, because as like me, she didn't eat pork. So I found that just like me, gradually my friendship with her vaccinated me against my own prejudices against Jews. So I get more Jewish friends, and I stopped viewing Jews as a group. And today I'm part of the Jewish community in Denmark, and their pain is my pain too. But as a teenager, I was on the receiving end of the hate. One day I was walking down the street and I was wearing a headscarf, and suddenly a young guy spat on me, and I couldn't bring myself to remove the slime that was hanging from my headscarf. I hated him and all other Danes. But then one day I started working in a supermarket, and my boss and my colleagues were very nice. So my friendship with Jews and Danes have vaccinated me against my own prejudices. So when my friend told me that I should confront my own racism, I thought that I had already put that racism behind me. But I still decided to go home, turn on my computer, and open the folder where I have saved all the hate mails. And there were literally hundreds of them. Emails that started with words like terrorist, crackhead, rat, whore. I decided to contact the one who had sent me the most. His name was Ingolf. My goal was to make him good again. Because I thought that if he met a Muslim like me, who supported democracy and paid tax, he would apologize and became good again. So I know it sounds crazy, but that was my starting point. A couple of days later, we met at his house, and I will never forget when he opened his front door and reached out to shake my hand. I felt so disappointed because he looked nothing like I imagined. I expected a horrible person, a dirty house. It was not. His house smelled of coffee, which he served from a coffee set identical to the one my parents used. I ended up staying for 2.5 hours. And we have so much in common. Even our prejudices were alike. Gradually and painfully, I came to realize that I had been judgmental, just like the one who had sent me the hate mails. This was the beginning of what I call #dialogue coffee. Basically, I sit down for coffee with people who are writing the most terrible things to me to try to understand why they hate people like me and they don't even know me. And I have been doing this the last 10 years. Most of the people I approach agree to meet me. Most of them are men, but I have also met women. I have made it a rule to always meet them in their house to convey from the outset that I trust them. I always bring food because when we eat together, it's easier to find what we have in common and make peace together. Along the way, I have learned some valuable lessons. The people who send hate mails are employees, husbands, parents, wives, and I'm not saying that their behavior is acceptable, but I have learned to distance myself from their behavior, hateful views, without distancing myself from the people who's expressing those hateful views. And I have discovered that people I visit are just as afraid of people they don't know as I was afraid of them before I began inviting myself for coffee. And during these meetings, a particular theme keeps coming up. It shows up regardless of whether I'm speaking to a woman or man, a Muslim or a Christian. They all seem to think that other people are to stop blame for the hate and generalizations of groups. They believe that other people have to stop demonizing. They point at politicians, the media, their neighbors, but we all have power and influence there we are, so we must never underestimate our own potential. And the dialogue coffee meetings have taught me that people of all political convictions can be caught demonizing those with different views. And I know itself because I grew up with prejudices and ideas about enemies of different sorts. But over the years, I have met many people who have insisted on speaking to me. If you have met me for 10, 20 years ago, I was a racist. And then they followed me as a democratic citizen and a bridge builder. So if you want to prevent hate or violence, we have to talk to as many people as possible, as open as possible, while being as open as possible. And that can only be achieved through debate, critical conversation, and insisting on dialogue that doesn't demonize people. And people ask me again and again if any of the people I have met for dialogue coffee have changed their opinions. But that is not the point of dialogue. Because dialogue is not about changing people's opinions. It's about learning to live with the fact that we can have conflicting views. And we can become aware of our own prejudices through conversation. But for me, all opinions are legitimate as long as they don't increase violence. But that doesn't mean that all views are equally good, because the democratic views will always be better than undemocratic views. But dialogue coffee works. Let me give you an example. One day I visited a man who called Kim, and it's not your Kim, and he is in favor of death penalty, and he wants to kill Muslims. On a Friday afternoon in front of the mosque. But as Denmark has a strict law of weapons, he can't get a gun. He never writes words like rakat or whore, but his words heard in other way. He always say, Ozlem with the sweet brown eyes. You can't stay in my country because we want a pure Denmark. One day I visited him in his little holiday home. Kim also believes that rape is the fault of the victim, not the rapist. At the one point he looked at me and he said, if we are sitting here naked and you was sitting here naked, will something happen between us? And I always come alone to dialogue coffee. And I glanced over the wall by the sink where a number of kitchen knives were hanging. So I started counting them. There were 17. And I was frightened. So I decided to say it out loud. And I said, Kim, I'm frightened. How should I be? And I could see that my questions shocked him. And he said, no, I would never dream of harming you. But I was also frightened before you arrived. And I asked him, why? And he said, I thought you would bring all your Muslim cousins with you to smash up my house. And it's a bit tragic because Kim and I were the same age. We hadn't met each other before. We both spoke the same language and considered Denmark to be our country. We have sitting opposite each other, but we were afraid of each other. We are not born with such feelings, but still we are afraid of each other. I have been talking to Kim for several years now. There are many trenches between us, but bridges have also been built. When my mother got cancer, Kim was the first to call to wish her a long life. So Kim has many identities. Some of you maybe say he is a racist, but he is also a husband, an employee, a son, a neighbor, and a citizen. When we label people, when we call them racist, we forget to consider the whole person and instead reduce them to one opinion. And in the last 10 years of drinking dialogue coffee, I have not met anyone who has become less racist as a result of being called a racist. Never. So demonizing each other isn't the solution. Talking together without judging and listening to each other is the least part of the solution. And this is my, I believe that we also have to look inwards and face our own prejudices, acknowledge our own responsibility to be part of the change and take care of our democracy. And this is why I found an organization called Bridge Builders. We have 5,000 members, and we are developing tools for preventing polarization and how we can prevent echo chambers and how we can prevent demonizing with people with different views. For instance, we have trained around 600 school children, and we'll beginning with 500 school children, to give them tools how they can be tolerant of people they means the opposite what they believe. And soon we will be trained teachers as well in how they can train their students. We are constantly working on new project and that can help increase dialogue, and our standing point is always this: bridges can only be built if we all take personal responsibility for keeping the conversation going. The fight for democracy cannot be structure of someone else. Ingolf, you, me, and we all have the responsibility to reach out to others. So now, I want to give you a challenge. Before the end of the year, I challenge you to find someone you demonize, someone you disagree with, for example, because of Brexit, maybe politically or culturally, someone you think you have nothing in common with. I challenge you to invite someone like that to Dialogue Coffee. Remember Ingolf? I basically asking you to find an Ingolf in your life, contact him or her, and suggest that you have meet for Dialogue Coffee. And let me end by quoting my friend Cedric Uzan. Kim, he lost his son like you lost your sister. And after the terror attack in a Jewish synagogue in Copenhagen in 2015, a journalist asked him what he suggested he could do. And he could say anything, and everyone will understand him, because he has one son, and the terrorists kill him. But Cedric rejected any suggestion of revenge, and instead said this: evil can only be defeated by kindness between people. Kindness demands courage. So I hope that you are the courageous, and you will take my challenges and try to invite your Ingolfs to Dialogue Coffee. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say, so I interviewed Ozlem at the beginning of this year, and I found what she had to say to be very profoundly challenging, which is why I thought I'd just bring her here to challenge everybody else in the room as well. So next, you may have noticed Kim's not with us. Kim's at home, where she may have gone a bit crazy over the last few days. She's been trapped in. It's the last day of your isolation, isn't it, Kim? I think. So she's nearly ready to come out. We're really grateful to her for joining us. You are well, Kim, I hope, aren't you? Not joining us.
I am well, thank you, Ros, I am well.
Cheers, well, brilliant. So, I mean, Kim doesn't need very much introduction at this conference. Her very first local conference was, I think I'm right in saying, 2 years ago, when you came and spoke on the Britain Talks panel here for us again. And we're just incredibly proud that she now speaks to us as the MP for Batley and Span. Over to you, Kim. Go for it.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Ros. I'm so sorry I'm not there with you, Brighton. I wish I was. It's my last day of self-isolation. I am fine, I've not been too poorly, but I did test positive for COVID, which is why I am beaming in from West Yorkshire. But it's really nice to be part of this really special event, so thank you very much for inviting me, Ros. Yeah, I mean, I've been really proud to support the Britain Talks initiative since its inception. And that's partly because I get to work with the wonderful Ros and the Mirror, and also because the project was very closely aligned with the work of the Joe Cox Foundation, the charity we set up after Joe was murdered. And it's been a long and painful journey for me over the last 5 years. And I have somehow ended up here today, wearing a very different hat and with a very different life to the one that I had before that horrific day. So I don't sit here as an expert, but I sit here as someone who has got very real lived experience of the very worst possible consequences of the politics of hate. And I believe that the politics of hate and division are fueled by not talking and not listening. And I think everything that Ozlem has said is absolutely brilliant, and I think I've got so much respect for you for the work that you've done in Denmark. And this is another reason that I'm a big fan of the Britain Talks project. And this is about not just talking to and listening to those that we agree with, but perhaps more importantly, talking with and listening to those that we often quite passionately disagree with. And I also believe that the Labour Party should be about bringing people together and not pushing or driving them apart. And I think that talking and listening is one of the very best ways to do this. So I've spent the last few years since Jo's murder looking at ways that we can bring people together at a community level, and I'm now really keen to do so in the political arena. In her maiden speech to Parliament, Jo now famously said that as she travelled around the multicultural constituency of Batley and Spen, despite our many differences, she observed that we are far more united and have far more in common than that which divides us. And in recent years, these words have come to resonate as a beacon of hope in difficult times. And it's a philosophy I wholeheartedly subscribe to. And I think this is one thing we need to do more of as politicians, maybe as the media, and certainly as a party. Focus on the common ground and the shared priorities of people and of our constituents. And part of this, for me, and Ozlem has alluded to this, is the ability to acknowledge our multiple identities. Because whatever our faith or gender or race or sexuality, we can often coalesce around the things that we share. And often that is shared frustrations of our day-to-day lives. And certainly up here in Batley and Spen during the by-election, it was things like the state of the roads or the quality of education for our kids or the lack of doctor's appointments or even the weather, the things that brought people together and we coalesced around. Because whatever else we might be, we're all also drivers and parents and patients, or the person who forgets their umbrella when it's chucking it down, as it has been today up here in Yorkshire. And during the by-election, I talked a lot, no surprises there, some will say, but I listened a lot as well. And this was certainly one of the most notable things, the shared things that matter to people in their day-to-day lives. But I have to be honest, some of the best conversations were the challenging conversations, were the conversations with people who didn't automatically agree and understand where I was coming from. Because focusing on common ground is very important, but it's not the same as pretending that there aren't differences or disagreements. So I guess the question is, what do we do with those differences and those disagreements? And for me, very much as Ozlem has said, this is about us being open-minded, and it's about us not being entrenched in our own positions. We need to be better at embracing and celebrating our differences, and where we do disagree, we need to find ways to do so respectfully, with robust, passionate, but civilised debate. And we need to be prepared to work at understanding why people feel how they feel, not just dismiss their points of view because they're different to our own. And as kids, Jo and I knew the power of diversity and the beauty of difference in human beings. And I think that's where our approach to life comes from. We were always both really interested in other people and always had lots of questions whenever we met someone new. And from a young age, we took great pleasure in hearing stories of people from a wide range of backgrounds. The differences weren't necessarily a focus, but nor were they invisible. There was something to be discussed and cherished and celebrated. And different opinions were a way of us educating ourselves about the world around us. So as MPs, I think we need to act as role models in this regard. Firstly, by ensuring that our own debate on issues on which we disagree is strong and powerful, but also respectful. And also also by working on a cross-party basis when it's possible to do so. And Joe did this brilliantly on the issue of loneliness. I hope to do the same when it's in the interest of my constituents and of the country. Now, I know that that might not sit well with some people within the Labour Party. And don't get me wrong, there are some people in Parliament that I would probably never be able to work closely with. But I think it's really important to do so when we can. At a community level, I think it's really important that we create opportunities for people to meet people from different backgrounds. And in real life, exactly as Ozlem has been doing. Not just in the echo chambers or the polarised battlefields of social media. And that's what the Joe Cox Foundation does really well through the Great Get Together campaign and the More in Common network of community groups that it's developed. And many other organisations in the voluntary sector do similar excellent work. And I think this is something we should all support, whatever sector we might work in. The More in Common group in Batley and Spen is a bunch of people that came together in the aftermath of Joe's murder, when the tension within our community was palpable, and it would have been very easy for us to be divided by what had happened. But that didn't happen. What often happens in the most tragic and horrific of situations is that people come together. What upsets me is that often we have to wait for a crisis or a tragedy to see that. You know, the pandemic is a good example of this. How can we harness that sense of coming together when things aren't so horrific or so tragic? And this bunch of people that came together were just amazing, but on the surface appeared to have very little in common. So we're this kind of strange, dysfunctional family, but it works, and we achieved an awful lot of fantastic things. And a lot of that has been through very powerful conversations, the kind of conversations that Britain Talks and Europe Talks has facilitated. And this More in Common principle is about reaching out to people from different backgrounds to bridge divides and to make a difference on the issues that affect us all. Bringing people together, celebrating the things that we've got in common, but promoting mutual respect and understanding, and building a strong community where everyone has a sense of identity and belonging. And as I say, we're building the network through the foundation of these different groups. In June, we have the Great Get Together campaign that we do on what would have been Joe's birthday. It's a really powerful way of remembering Joe. A weekend of events where we use sport and arts and crafts and music and games and quizzes and, of course, cake to bring people together. And before you know it, through this shared sense of doing something, friendships are formed and bridges are built. And I suppose this is a kind of alternative approach to what Ozlem has done and what Britain Talks does. We start with the common ground, and then we have the challenging conversations on the top of that common ground. Whereas the other approach is to go in on the differences and then build the commonalities from that. And I think actually there's a place for both. We've had some great stuff happen. I'm really good friends with the local vicar and the local imam, and they do a brilliant assembly where they go into schools and they talk about their differences. They talk about the fact that they have different religions, they support different football teams, they like different food. But in the middle of all that difference, they've got this really powerful friendship. And I'm not going to get on to Paul's love of the Lee Centurions rugby club and my love of the Batley Bulldogs. But, you know, I'm sure Paul, despite that difference there, we would have huge amounts of things in common. And just because you're a Man United fan and I'm saddled with Huddersfield Town, we would move beyond those differences and join in our love of football. And I think that's really sort of how we've worked through the foundation, through the More in Common network. And, you know, I'm a little bit naughty sometimes, call it cohesion by stealth, because you have that shared thing that brings you together, and whether you're chatting to someone of a different faith, of a different religion, gender, sexuality, with a disability, it doesn't matter, because you stop seeing those things, and you come together with that shared sense of togetherness. And I think that's what Britain Talks has done really well. It's cut beyond the differences, it's acknowledged them and it's talked about them, but it's also found that common ground for people. So to finish, I think, you know, for me, do we need to keep talking? Yes. Do we need to keep listening? Yes. Do we need to focus on bringing people together rather than driving them apart and preventing polarisation before we get there? Absolutely. And do we all have a role to play in this? I passionately believe that we do. I just wish that I was there with you in person, so I could give you all a big Labour Party conference hug. And sadly I can't, but it's a real pleasure to be part of this event. And thank you very much, Ros, for inviting me. And I look forward to hearing other people's contributions. Enjoy the warm wine and the curled up sandwiches. And I hope to see you all in person very soon. Thank you.
Thank you to Kim. We'll send you some warm wine. We'll send you some curled up sandwiches. So next up we've got Paul Mason, who's the author of How to Stop Fascism. Again, doesn't need much introduction to this Labour conferences. How many did you say you've been to now, was it?
Well, not how many, it's since, the first one was 1980.
1980. It's been to a few Labour conferences. Paul, as we know, is an award-winning journalist, writer, filmmaker. He's the author of 7 books, including How to Stop Fascism, his most recent book, 3 plays, including Why It's Kicking Off Everywhere. He was at Economic Centre of BBC Newsnight. He was on Channel 4 News. He's an active Labour member, and it's very interesting to. One of the reasons I asked him is because I see that he bridges a divide within the party and goes between different factions, and is very interesting in that regard. A lot of people are very settled within their own safe silo in the conference, so I thought it would be a great opportunity to hear from Paul. Anyway,
Well, thank you. And Kim, hello, fantastic to see you. We were both in Batley at a certain moment on fighting a common cause. At least your rugby team has actually won a match in a season. Mine haven't. Thank you for inviting me. I'm fascinated by this. I'm going to introduce a kind of slight note of darkness into this. I suppose somebody, a journalist should. So I was covered the Gaza war. I've been shelled by the Israelis. I've had a bag full of children placed at my feet in a hospital ward, dead. And in Gezi Park in Turkey, I got shot with a CS gas canister an inch above the rim of my helmet. An inch below, I would probably lost an eye. These are traumatic events. In Kenya, covering an ethnic conflict was really, really nasty, and nasty in ways that I don't even know what to talk about. I've had to, drive at speed through crowds of people with machetes who didn't want us to get through their roadblock. But nothing triggers me. Journalists train to deal with post-trauma. Post-traumatic stress is normal. Post-traumatic stress disorder is when you've not dealt with it. But nothing ever triggers me in terms of the stress of dealing with stuff more than the online abuse I get, which doesn't involve danger, it doesn't involve being threatened with a knife or shot in the head or seeing dead people. But it is really, really effective. Some of it is anonymous, and you can filter a lot of that out. But some of it is not. There's an American author of anti-wokeness, a real big culture warrior called James Lindsay, quite famous, who I got into a dialogue with on Twitter openly, just talking about philosophy, about Hegel, if you know what Hegel is. And at some point it must have snapped him, because he then just said, yeah, and I've slept with your mother. Openly. Yeah, I mean, my mother's dead. And what an offensive thing to say. And sometimes it's within our movement. On the day, in fact on the hour, Keir Starmer was elected, because I supported Keir and didn't support the left candidate, I make no suggestion whatsoever that this was in any way to do with any candidate. Nuisance calls started to my phone from people I then discovered were filming themselves making these calls, and one of them was a trade union official. The trade union in question knows who it was. Others were anonymous. Others were random people who'd been given. My number had been posted on a number of websites, so people just started ringing me up at once. And even this week, it's been going on. I mean, I got into an argument about Catholicism. I was physically abused as a schoolboy, not badly, but it's pretty traumatic. And when I mentioned this, it takes a lot of, you have to sort of think about whether you're going to do this, talk about this as a reason for a political position you've taken. I quite expected people to say, well, we don't agree with that, it's illegitimate, or you're a class traitor, which is the subject of some of the emails I get. But what I didn't expect was for someone to tweet, the priest should have hit you harder. And I didn't expect 10 people, some of whom are Labour members, to like that tweet. Now, I'm not going to get anywhere in politics or in public life by allowing this to permanently kind of piss me off. I just can't. Because the task of bringing people together, even at this conference, I've been trying to do it, as you say, crisscrossing the barbed wire. I'm not going to let this get me down. And for those of us who have to suffer it, and there are others, and some MPs, you know, and I'm sure you, Kim, will have to endure this, you know, as sadly Joe endured the most chilling sacrifice. We can't afford to do it. But in order to get beyond it, we've got to name it. And here's what I want to kind of, here's what something I want to introduce a vocabulary that we don't often use in politics. To me, what these people are doing is evil. I don't think they are evil. Some maybe, but what the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition teaches us, and we must cling on to, is that there is in the world a thing called evil. We don't quite understand where it comes from. You can't reduce it to genes and neuroscience. I don't think you can, and social upbringing. But if you can identify it, every major religion has been geared to trying to deal with it and de-escalate it and make it less evil. And in fact, even actually Pache vis-a-vis Catholicism has the idea of a really bad thing and a not so bad sin, a sort of the venal sin and the cardinal sin. Yeah? Remember, so I've learned all that. Those priests really taught me a lot. But so, in using the word evil, what I'm trying to do is introduce into the discussion something that the left just doesn't have, and it's just moral philosophy. And Karl Marx, one of my intellectual heroes, used to laugh at the idea of moral philosophy for a good reason. He said, what does Nancy in Oliver Twist need with a moral philosophy? Because her position as a sex worker and trafficked woman and domestic abuse victim is not solvable by any priest or vicar in 19th century England. But one of the problems is, we as a workers' movement, yes, I did come to the Blackpool Conference 1918, the Brighton Conference not long after that. We as a workers' movement ignored Karl Marx, actually. My granddad and my dad had in their minds something called class consciousness. Everything we've got, we have to fight for. That's what it is. We stick together. Sometimes it's quite xenophobic. We don't like outsiders. And I don't mean East Europeans or black people. I mean, we just don't like people from Batley. Was the thing. But they kind of, that moral philosophy, which is what it was an implicit moral philosophy, asking two questions. What does a good society look like? And what does a good person in that society look like? And how do they behave? In case you don't know, and why would you? Because our education system is not brilliant and many of us haven't had access to education. That is just the moral philosophy of a Greek guy called Aristotle, who asked those things. And he said, humans are political animals, they form societies, and in those societies, they gear their moral behaviour to becoming good citizens in a good society. Now, that's not the only moral code on offer, there are others. There are others. That happens to be the one that was built into Christianity in the Middle Ages by St. Augustine and by Thomas Aquinas. But you don't have to be a Christian or any religion to see that there are moral philosophical questions that are important. And one of them is, faced with this kind of stuff that I get, that Kim gets, that other MPs get, many of you may get, on what basis do we ask for the de-escalation? Because what you've been doing, I'm utterly impressed by what you've been doing, because you're crossing cultures, crossing divides. There's a question, on what basis do I ask you to desist from doing this? Mine would be, first of all, solidarity. Remembering my granddad, if we don't stick together, we're screwed. If we don't stick together in the fight for the other things we want, social justice, climate justice, racial justice, we're screwed. But there's another basis that I think we can use. There's another dimension that we can open up if we just ask ourselves, what is my ethical code? On what basis do I judge myself whether it was a good idea to tweet this thing to Paul or to say something offensive to him or whatever? No, it's like this. If you're good at something, so if you immerse yourself in a thing, let's choose anything at random, like say rugby league or cricket, right? You know, an amateur at rugby or cricket or anything you can say, ballroom dancing, they can look at it and they can go, I can roughly work out what this is about. When you immerse yourself on something, it could be conference arrangements committee at Labour conference, you discover a whole world of complexity and you become really good at making fine judgments. Shall we pass this motion? Was that a try? Was he offside? Was that triple Solco in the ice cream a good one or a bad one? If we don't have a moral philosophical code, all we're left with, we're like a spectator on Strictly. We don't really know how people take moral decisions. Now, I'm an atheist, and I'm no fan of organised religions, but without it, and then what? Without the class consciousness, because that world I grew up in Leigh in Lancashire, of my granddad and dad, horrible though some aspects of it were, had a shared culture. If we don't have that, where are we? We're lost. And we haven't got some of the things we're really worried about, like, you know, all the things that are controversial about the things I believe, or any of you believe, that we've only got politics to sort them out. This in particular is why I think we've got into a dead end in the so-called debate over trans rights. Because there are arguments on both sides. It is what political philosophers call a debate over the theory of rights. So you know, the Equalities Act, the Gender Recognition Act, these are two laws. And a political philosopher would lead you to a certain point over that. And they say, this is a right, that's a right, they're not compatible. Can we develop within our idea of a good society? How do we mediate between the two sets of rights? And that's, I think, that's the base one where we should be on these questions. But there are also moral issues. And because we don't have the same level of sophistication to talk about moral philosophy, we have no tools for resolving the differences. And so what I want to do, it's a very strange thing to be doing for an atheist, is trying to initiate a debate within civil society, within the labour movement, within the wider organisations we are in, about what is a good human being. My dad and granddad and grandma and mother, they were not that enthusiastic labour movement people, they were enthusiastic strikers and fist fighters and anti-fascists, very much so. But they were that keen on going to branch meetings. But they had a really clear moral code. And if you transgressed it, unfortunately, some of that moral code was you couldn't be gay. You know, if you couldn't be an out gay man in that world. They had a moral code. One of my books I described, there's a word for in Lancashire, force. In Lancashire accent, force. It means false. I traced it to its Anglo-Saxon roots, and it means, it had many meanings for Anglo-Saxons. It meant people who whisper. It meant people who lie, false people. But in other words, everybody who isn't exactly as they should be and open. Now, that generation has gone, that implicit moral code has gone, and many of us live multiple lifestyles, including some of the people who send me these emails, where they're nice as pie to me in the street, and then the next minute they're texting me ridiculous bullshit. I'm sorry. We've lost the element of coherence to the forms of behaviour we ask of each other. You know, speaking as a very lapsed secular Catholic, there is, however, one other bit that we can learn from organised religions. There is the quality of redemption. Nobody, so we go around calling people, you're a transphobe, you're an anti-Semite, you're an Islamophobe, you're an anti-Catholic bigot. Actually, what we could do, if we wanted to, we could name the things, the verb. You're being racist, you're being transphobic. I don't want, if I meet a racist, I'm sure all the other trade unionists in this room will know this, the first thing I think about is, how do I persuade them to become a communist? You know, how do I persuade them out of their racism through the joint effort in the class struggle? If I meet a scab, you know, and strikebreaker, I'm wanting to them to go on strike, not to kick their head in. So how do we persuade people to change? And I think that you might be, I'm coming at this from a left field because I think that's the missing bit of this discussion. I don't want to write people off as transphobes, you know, the bigots and the rest of it. I want to give them a route out because there are, as we've discussed in here, in this discussion, there's a lot of them. And they're being amplified and echo chambered by the internet to an extent that I never remember. And I'll finish on that, just one final thing. Yes, see, I was on the far left in this party in the 80s, and I wasn't in Militant. Militant got expelled. I was in a Trotskyist group that was, you know, would have been called an entryist group. I claimed my right to be in the Labour Party. And I loved being in the Labour Party. I loved being on CLP, and I loved being a delegate to conferences and everything about it. You know, we used to sit in the bars discussing with real Cold War right-wing Labour types, people who thought the MI5 should probably be on to us. But because we had a common culture, and we were all mainly working-class men, and we all ordered the same drink, we all knew how to go to the bar in the same way, and elbow somebody out of the way. Yeah. They were all white as well, I'm sorry to say, male civilians. I could discuss these really deep differences that we have in the Labour movement without somebody, you know, insulting me or me insulting them. There were people in the restaurant behind me yesterday were just doing selfish shouting, "Fuck Keir Starmer." Okay, I opposed Neil Kinnock. I didn't ever go around saying "fuck Neil Kinnock." You know what I mean? So we've lost it. We have to recognise, having lost it, we must bring something in its place. That's the end. Thanks.
And I think there's probably a number of us here would like to just say that we're really sorry that we've had that experience at conference. It's really horrible. You know, it's happened to many of us over time, and it's horrible when it happens. And there should be a place where we can discuss ideas and be free to discuss ideas without stuff like that. I think it's really bad. So I'm going to introduce Kirsty Mcneill. Who again, I don't know how many conferences you've been to, Kirsty. I don't think you need a great introduction either. She's the author of Counterculture, How to Resist the Culture Wars, which is a brilliant pamphlet for fake news, which I really enjoyed and found just really fascinating. Her co-author, Roger Harding, is there as well, sitting modestly. Kirsty Save the Children's Executive Director for Policy, Advocacy and Campaigns, former Special Advisor in Number 10. She came to Downing Street, having led the policy and influencing work of data, basically working with Bono and Bob. She served on the board of Metropolitan History, and she's currently on the board of Larger Us, the Holocaust Educational Trust, and the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. So she's bringing you're wearing a lot of different hats and bringing a lot of experience to this discussion. So thanks, Kirsty.
And thanks, Ros. And I guess I'd like to start where Paul left off and invite you all to think about the last time somebody persuaded you of something. So the last time you changed your mind in response to an intervention from a fellow human being. And I would be absolutely amazed if that was immediately preceded by them inviting a pile-on on you from a bunch of strangers on the internet. I'd be amazed if it was directly preceded by them calling you a name. And I'd be amazed if it was directly preceded by them telling you that you'd failed a test you didn't even know you were sitting. And yet, despite politics being the business of persuasion and coalition building and creating constellations of interests, despite persuasion being the core task of politics, all the things I've just described are routinely how political people talk and behave. And that is why political people are routinely failing at the core task, I would argue, of politics. Now, that's because self-righteousness is our original sin.
as activists, right? The belief that we have hit upon the right way to think and to be and the right vision of society is so deep in our DNA. And that is terrible at the best of times. But I don't need to tell in this room, we are not in the best of times. That is absolutely existentially disastrous for progressives in a culture war time. And I want to tell you a little bit about our research and why it says that that's particularly damaging and dangerous right now. And it's because the behaviour that we indulge in, so I couldn't agree more with the colleague who says actually we've got a lot of power and agency here. The choices that we are making about how we respond to a culture war time, by design, have been set out and choreographed for us by culture warriors who want us to jump headlong into traps. And we do it again and again and again. Our own behaviour is being weaponised by culture war peddlers. And what is happening is they want us to believe that we are as divided and as angry as we appear on our social media feeds and in headlines. And those of you who organise in neighbourhoods and workplaces will know that is simply not true. This community in this country is nowhere near as angry and as polarised as the culture warriors would have you believe. But they are tapping into something, and they are able to weaponise three main things. The first is appeals to order and tradition. So the things that you hold dear are going to get taken from you, and you're not allowed to be who you are anymore because a nefarious them has ruled it out of order. Secondly, they're doing a fantastic job of magnifying the issue that is marginal but real, or in many cases, absolutely made up. And I'll give you just two examples of that. Some of you may have heard that there's an ongoing campaign to cancel the film Grease because it falls foul of new Me Too values. Now, there may be lots of us who don't want Grease to be repeated on the television because it's not a very good film, but it's not happening at the behest of organised feminism. Likewise, you may have heard that there was attempts to change what was sung at the end of the proms at the behest of the Black Lives Matter movement, and no such campaign was ever mounted by a racial equity campaigner. In Britain, there was an entirely sensible decision by the BBC that we shouldn't have mass singing during a pandemic because singing spreads COVID. And yet culture war peddlers did a fantastic job of magnifying this utterly fabricated issue to the extent that lots of people believed they had to have a view on it and actually swing in behind the campaign to cancel a song, a campaign that did not in fact exist. The third thing that culture war peddlers are extremely good at weaponising is zero-sum thinking, and for the trade unions in the audience this is particularly important. The idea that if someone is gaining, someone by definition must be losing. And we saw this at its most acute in the claim around the launch of the Sewell report, that somehow the problem with the education of white working class boys was not the chronic underinvestment in the education of white working class boys, but because teachers were spending too much time on critical race theory. If you can find me the state school in which that's taking place, I'd love to visit. And yet, this is happening to us again and again and again, and they're doing it for three main reasons. For some folks, it's just pure financial gain. It's a living, right? Whipping up outrage is literally their job. For some folks, it's about spreading their reach and reputation, and we should be honest and self-aware that this is happening on the left as well as on the right. The outrage merchants can be found everywhere. And the third, and this is probably the most relevant at a party political conference, is some folks are peddling culture wars because of the electoral gain that is available to them for doing so. And the way that electoral gain works is twofold. First of all, because it distracts people from talking about the real issues that are happening in our country. So every second that we spend talking about statues, we're not spending talking about low pay, we're not spending talking about actual structural racism and how it shows up in the pay gap, and we're not talking about public services and the underinvestment in them, we're not talking about housing. So partly it's a distraction, but also it is more acutely and more subtly an attempt to divide, and it divides progressives from one another, as we can see very acutely in the very arid and angry debate about trans rights. It divides progressives from one another, but crucially it also divides progressives from the country. And given that, it strikes me as so obviously bad for Labour. I think it's bad for all political parties, it's bad for our democracy, but it's so obviously bad for Labour. We have to ask ourselves, why nonetheless are Labour people so drawn into this kind of politics? Why do they leap so enthusiastically into the traps? And the report that we wrote started with a question, which is, am I here to win a culture war, or am I here to end one? And every single person, but particularly every single person associated with the labour movement, has to ask themselves that question. And the reason they find it so agonising, when to me the answer is obvious, that as progressives we should be trying to build people together, bring people together, because the heart of progressive politics is cooperation. You can't cooperate with people that you don't like. So it seems to me so obvious what the progressive answer to that question is, and yet Labour people find it agonising to answer it. And we concluded that the reason they find it agonising is because they believe, falsely in my view, that they're being asked to choose between their values and their voters. And that is, of course, an invidious choice. But I also believe it's a false one. And the reason that we concluded it's a false one is because there is a principled winning strategy rooted in solidarity. Solidarity across classes, solidarity across races, and solidarity intergenerationally. But we have to get comfortable talking a language of strategy and solidarity and having that inform a four-pronged strategy. And we concluded there's 4 pillars that would make that possible. The first is building a diverse movement, because one of the things that happens to progressives at the moment is campaigners for equality get caricatured because bogey figures are conjured who don't actually represent the median of opinion in any of the justice or equality campaigns that exist. But because people are not empowered to speak for themselves and platformed on behalf of the wider movement, it's easy to caricature. So if progressives want to get past that, they have to build a diverse movement where people can speak for themselves and rebut some of the ludicrous claims that are made about them for themselves, and that allies don't have to do that for them. Secondly, we'd have to become incredibly comfortable calling this out and saying it as we see it, and saying back to journalists, and I think the mainstream media does have some questions to answer here, people need to get very comfortable in saying, I see what you're doing, I know the game that's being played, and you know what, I'm not going to engage in that debate, and I don't think your readers or your viewers or your listeners want me to either, because you know what, they're not daft. So please let's stop treating them like they are. So a comfort and a confidence and a fluency in calling this out, because there's a familiarity with the strategy. Thirdly, there has to be a willingness to treat democracy as our first order principle. Now, people in this room might disagree hugely about policy outcomes, and frankly, there is not a policy outcome in the world that I care about as much as I care about democracy. And I care about the first order norms and values that make me a democrat and that inform how I talk to and about my fellow citizens. So there has to be a commitment to democratic norms, and there has to be a commitment to the kind of regulation and policy change, particularly of social media, that would allow democracy to flourish. And the fourth, and again for trade union colleagues in the room, I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts about this. We concluded that actually the fourth but probably most important pillar is building a vision of future abundance. So a view where zero sum doesn't have to dominate our politics, because there's enough for everyone and no one is left out. But crucially, it has to be a plausible route to future abundance if the public is going to step back from some of the divide and rule which proves marginally attractive at the moment. So there has to be an account of the economy that's simultaneously transformational, rooted in equality, but also highly credible for people to believe that in their lifetimes their kids will do better than them. So 4 areas to focus on, I think: building a diverse movement, being willing to call it out, saying you're a democrat before you're anything, and coming up with a plausible path to economic abundance. So not much, right? So I'm not going to claim that any of that is easy. Doing all 4 of those things simultaneously is unbelievably hard. But unfortunately, our conclusion is it is also unbelievably necessary.
Thank you. So now I'm going to turn to Darren Lewis, who is the Mirror's legendary football correspondent, and I think has been wondering a little bit why he was invited here today. But the truth is that the Euros this year, I think, just have been like a crucible for all of this kind of culture wars stuff, the way that it's played out. And Darren has been this just incredible voice fighting racism in football. He's personally tackled the UEFA president you know, like personally tackled him about it, and is just so well qualified to speak about what happened at the Euros, the really depressing aspects of what happened, but also the way that the country kind of came together in defence of 3 lads that kind of missed penalties. So over to you, Darren.
No, well, thanks a lot, Ros. And actually, to be honest with you, I should be thanking Ros, because the whole Britain Talks concept kind of buys right into this. And certainly we as a newspaper, because of the work that we've done, we've not been responding to what's been going on at the Euros. What we've been able to do is speak for those people who see themselves in those people who were targeted and marginalised. And there is a common theme, or we're seeing it now, I've written about it today, with those EU lorry drivers who suddenly are being offered temporary visas to come back and dig this country out of a hole, is that if you're black, if you're brown, if you're other, you get targeted and demonised and exiled. But when the country needs you, they embrace you, they welcome you. And you know, anyone who's ever experienced it knows what that feeling is. And you know, I was listening to Kirsty a second ago, and she articulated so well all of the culture wars that get infected to try and distract from the actual nuance of this, the hub of it. And anyone who's black or brown knows that sometimes the purpose of racism is distraction, to take you away from the things that can actually change. And also to kind of derail the people with the courage to change the things that they can. And I think the only slight thing, I don't even disagree really, because I do think the culture wars are confected, but we do have a very polarised country. We're split down the middle, and that's led by, as we all know, a Prime Minister who lots of people seek to defend, even though he comes out with the kind of thing that would get you or I sacked from our jobs on a daily basis. Britain doesn't talk at the moment, it tweets. and it reacts. In fact, it doesn't even listen before it reacts, precisely because it's so polarised. And I almost wonder if we've become the kind of real life version of the kind of mid-morning talk show that we used to laugh at, because we allow ourselves to be sometimes fighting these wars that we don't need to fight. And certainly a big part of the work that we as a newspaper has been doing is sidestepping those culture wars and giving people the voice that they don't have, which is precisely what Britain Talks is all about, allowing people to talk to each other, but also allowing us to talk for the people who don't have the ability to articulate their position themselves. And I think when you are black, when you are brown, not a sportsman or a celebrity, but an ordinary person, you need someone able to say, that's what I'm going through, that's where I am, that's why I won't get listened to, but that person is speaking for me. And that's what we try to do at the Daily Mirror. I think in general terms, there is a common theme, and Paul's articulating it. In fact, everyone on the panel's been articulating it. There's a common theme through all of the different groups of people that are either demonised or marginalised. It's class, it's race, and we've seen it before many, many times. We've seen the whole concept of if somebody is gaining something, that means someone else must be losing something, that you articulated, Kirsty. We saw it in the 70s, where people were asked if you wanted a black guy living next to you, because if you did, then vote for this party, because then you'll be in trouble. We've seen it all before, so none of it is new to us. That's, I think, a big part of why we need to talk, but more importantly, why we need to listen. Britain doesn't listen. Britain just all wants to talk at the same time. If you go onto social media, that's what Twitter is. It's just a cacophony of noise. People shouting at each other. I used to think that was the Daily Mail, but it's now become Twitter. Yeah. I think where we've moved forward is that modern Britain is actually starting to speak for itself. Modern black Britain is starting to speak for itself. And if I focus on that for a bit, because for me it's, I think, where we've seen some of the biggest change over the last 18 months or so. Not out of all recognition, I have to say, just in terms of moving the dial from -5 to 0. I think that schools across the country had kids writing letters of support for England's black, racially abused footballers at the Euros. That was an education in itself. I'd never seen in 20 years of covering football an England international footballer take the Home Secretary to task for basically stoking the kind of thing with a refusal to condemn the people booing our own national team footballers, and then turning around and saying, I want to show solidarity with those footballers at the end of the European Championship. That stopped being about football, and that started being about the people with the courage to change the things they could do, using that courage, using that platform. And it isn't just for footballers to do that, it's for us as media organisations to do it, it's for us as MPs to do it, it's for all of the people in the institutions where black people don't have power, don't have agency, to either get black people on those platforms or use those platforms to change things. Not just to talk about what's wrong, not just to talk about what's bad, but to change it. I think what we've got at the moment, regardless of whether we do that or not, is a generation that's prepared to rewrite the rules. It's a generation here in this country that wants to talk, that wants to engage, not part of those culture wars trying to divide us, but as part of a new dialogue where it kind of brings everyone together, where everyone can be their authentic self. But they're not asking for it, they're getting it because technology is providing it for them. It's providing them with a platform to be able to say what they want to say. And generations like ours won't stop. I think it's an inexorable movement towards a situation where younger people have that power and are using that power. We're seeing black and brown people opening up about being the only person in the room, about the lack of opportunities in industries that simply were not built for them, about the abuse and the vilification they're routinely subjected to when they try to speak truth to power. We've seen black politicians on this side of the divide, on both sides of the divide, as getting the kind of abuse that obviously led to the worst situation we could think of. Britain doesn't want to talk to them. It doesn't even want to talk for those people, so they want to speak for themselves. And I think that's another element, if you like, to the Britain's talk concept, because obviously, as we saw with the European angle to it, we do have us now talking between countries. But within our country, we need to talk within races. We don't do that enough. We already know, as you were saying, as everyone's been saying, that parts of our society want to keep that wedge between the different races, so they will confect those culture wars. They will keep that last night of the proms nonsense going. They will keep all of those things that will get people wound up and calling into the Jeremy Vine show and all of that coppers. They'll do it because what they want is a country that is black and white, not a country that talks. It doesn't want a country that talks. It doesn't want a country that listens. It doesn't want a country that is willing to understand and has the kind of solidarity that we saw during the summer of last year. And since then, it doesn't want people to come over to the other side to say, I'm going to listen, I'm going to learn, I'm going to read, I'm going to do it. It doesn't want that. What it wants is a country that's polarized, so that your situation continues to be your situation if you are black and you are brown, and they can have a nod to it, but they won't do anything about it because this is not a system that's built for you if you are black and you are brown. That's the next big challenge for the Britain Talks concept. That's where we have to take this thing. Just to give you a couple of reasons why. This country doesn't listen when black and Asian people die from COVID. So we wring our hands and we get upset about it. But when vaccine priority lists come out and you look down the list, you don't see any black and brown people on that list eligible for vaccines. Because it wants to say it's listening, but it doesn't actually listen. The National Crime Agency reported last year that between 2019 and 2020 there were 31,700 black and brown people going missing. This country doesn't listen to them. You look at the amount of black mothers and fathers that go to the police and ask for help and get told there's nothing we can do for you. If they're blonde and they're blue-eyed, they are everywhere. We are still nearly 14 years later looking for Mandy McCann.
Yeah.
And there are black and brown children that Britain doesn't listen to. Britain doesn't talk for them. Britain doesn't talk to them. These are the reasons why this is the next big challenging element of this concept. We don't get to tell our stories unless they are extremes of the divide, unless they're trauma, unless they're racism, unless they're sport and celebrity. But ordinary black and brown people don't get the chance to tell their stories. Apart from all the stuff you were saying about sport, Ros, I was thinking today, I've been a columnist for probably, a year and a half now, and for much of that time, I've spent talking about that divide, that racial divide, because it comes up again, and they say, you're a columnist, talk about lots of different things. But I look across Fleet Street, how many black columnists are there? This thing wasn't built for us. It wasn't built for you if you're brown. It wasn't built for you if you're black. It's built for you if you're white. So I have to keep using that voice, that platform. I have to keep talking for the people who don't have a voice, and I have to keep talking to the people who look like me to say, at least there's someone saying it as it is, for better or for worse. Our next big challenge is to make sure that we keep amplifying black voices, so that if we're going to find kids, if we're going to speak for the people who have lost people who work for the NHS, not just call them heroes, but keep them alive, keep their communities alive, support them, support the ordinary people. We have to talk to them.
So that's why I asked Darren to be on the last, definitely not least, Unite Steve Turner, the Assistant General Secretary of Unite the Union, a proud Londoner, a Millwall FC fan. He has been brilliant in supporting Britain Talks, and I think there's something very interesting to me. I think trade unionists understand Britain Talks a lot better than some other bits of our movement, because exactly some of the things Paul's talked about was about, you're trying to constantly persuade people within a community to follow you. It's about persuasion and comradeship and community and solidarity, and Steve's an expert on all these things. So
Yeah, sorry, I was like, I didn't sit on the end. I didn't realise it was a seat on the end. I would have come and sat here earlier. I don't know that. Well, thanks very much for that one. And thanks for laying this on again. It's incredibly important, I think, this whole subject. And I've sat there and I've just engaged in a conversation with people that has really opened up my mind as well. And I think it does challenge all of us. It challenges our own discriminations and the way in which we feel about other people and how we emotionally engage in discussions with the people around us. I've been discriminated against all my life, normally on the basis of class and accent, and the fact that I'm a Millwall supporter. I can't for 1 second think that I can, put myself in the place of a young black lad who lives down the street from me, who's involved in a postcode gang because he doesn't feel he belongs anywhere, has any power or any identity outside of his postcode or his estate, and then goes to war with the estate next door or the postcode along the street. And it's incredibly important that this whole discussion takes place about Britain Talks and listens. We don't just talk to one, we listen to one another. And Paul made the point about we all have our enemies, and sometimes they're closer to us than we think. And for me and a lot of people around me, I live in South London, it was always North London. People used to say the North-South divide starts at Watford, but it didn't actually, it started at the Thames. And that still continues for many, many people, and they don't know why, and it's historical, and it's rooted in our communities. But I'll tell you what, it's very real. For a lot of people, it is incredibly real. And if we don't listen to people and engage with people in a conversation, we're going to be in trouble for a long time to come. So look, when I had a conversation with Ros about this, I didn't want to talk about that at all. That was just things that come to my mind while I was listening to others. I wanted to talk about an experience that I've had personally, but we led in terms of the trade union movement in response to the growing threat and the rise of the far right recently. And it came to us, we had a long discussion following marches in central London that saw thousands of people on the streets actually, and in towns and cities across our communities, being led by newly emerging, very vicious, very hateful of course, right-wing groups. And thousands converged on Whitehall, Trafalgar Square and Westminster a few years ago, zig-hailing in the name of Britain at the Cenotaph. And that made me feel, what's that all about? What is this all about? Who are on these marches? Clearly there are some very nasty fascist elements on these marches and the organisers of them, mainly online of course. It's not necessarily the way in which it was organised when I was younger and you knew where they were and where they drunk and you went and met them on street corners and did what you did. But the reality is they're now organised in a very different way. They're much more sophisticated in their narrative now. They're much more engaged in opportunist and populist narratives. They meet people on their phones, on their smartphones, in their living rooms, in their bedrooms, on laptops and iPads, and they engage with them in a conversation about hate and division, and they take people on a journey towards hating others and dividing our society. They're not in your face in the way in which we would expect right-wing, far-right fascists to be in your face. They organise marches against paedophilia and rape and gang rape in communities where we know there has been a problem. And I remember an example of a demonstration that was taking place in Rotherham, and it was against paedophilia. And there was a demonstration that involved mainly the white working class actually in Rotherham, but a group of miners who are no longer miners of course because they closed the pits, but they're still very close community in the Rotherham area, decided they were going to attend this demonstration, and they took their National Union of Mine Workers banner with them on this demonstration. And they didn't want to march with the English Defence League who'd organised the demonstration. They wanted to march behind them because they wanted to protest against paedophilia in their society. They wanted to engage in a discussion. And they went on that demonstration. They were about 50 yards behind the main demonstration and got accused of being fascists and racists by the opponents of the demonstration that were behind barriers all the way down the street, hurling abuse at them. And they couldn't comprehend why that was the case, how that had come about. These were far from fascists. These were not racists. These were not members or supporters of the EDL. They come out in a cause. And one of the reasons they come out in a cause is because the leader of the local branch of the NUM had a very difficult childhood, gone into his family anyway. His young daughter was taken away from him, was put into a home and was then abused. And he wanted to come out and express his solidarity, as his colleagues did, with the theme of the march. And when they found out, of course, it was the EDL, they didn't want to be part of it, but they still wanted to express their solidarity. And they had a discussion about why that was, why they were being hurled abuse from others who should know better, actually, and being classified as racist, along with some that were no doubt racist. And we had a long discussion inside our union, Unite, about how we were going to deal with that. Not that we had some miraculous answer to it, but we thought that we've got to do more than simply counter-protest demonstrations by the far right. And we've got to do more than simply accuse people that attend demonstrations of being racists and fascists. We've got to identify what is it that draws people to support the objectives of some of these, or the arguments that are put forward by some of these bodies, and gets them to take part in public demonstrations of what many of us would regard to be hate and division within our communities. How do we start to have a conversation with our people in our communities about what the real intent of what some of these organisations are really about? And we set up a sort of campaigning group within the union called Unity Over Division. And I was charged with pulling it together and then rolling it out across the union. And Unity Over Division has been a very successful campaign at trying to engage in very difficult conversations with our members, trying to create that message of solidarity, actually, that you were talking about earlier, and not taking people at face value, but understanding their lived experiences and why it is perhaps that they hold the views that they do. And when you delve into it, I mean, the earlier message that I gave about young people in my community in South London about not belonging anywhere, not feeling that they belong, feeling that their identity has been removed from them. They don't live in their society. It's not their community any longer. The fact that they feel ignored, not just by politicians at Westminster, but by everybody, actually. Nobody's listening to the problems and the challenges that they've got. That the far right have very simple, straightforward answers to some of the real genuine problems that they face, whether that's about housing, or whether that's about jobs and unemployment, whether it's about local services, whether it's about community services. The far right will often have that very sharp answer to it. The reason your kids can't get in an house and your community is being broken up is because there's too much immigration. Rather than having the discussion about we haven't built a council house in the last 40 years and the fact that we haven't, we need 1 million new council houses to be built, and that's a political question for Westminster and local government, and funding of local services is actually a political question. And if you want to resolve that, it's not simply about there are too many people looking for the same services. The service is not being funded adequately enough to meet the demands of the community. So how do we have that discussion with people? How do we start to change people's minds, not by saying that they're wrong or shouting facts and figures at them or assuming that they are what they're not? How do we have a sensible, difficult conversation in our workplaces, in our pubs, in our communities, on the bus, in our homes very often? Very difficult conversations that people shy away from. We don't want to have it. It's the point you were making. We don't want to listen. We don't want to have a conversation. So we established Unity Over Division, and we worked with a whole group of specialist organisations that came to training and conference days with us, where we brought our shop stewards together in particular communities where we knew we had some issues, actually. And we worked with our officers and our regions to identify those communities where we think that we could use the programme as a bit of a springboard for a conversation. And those conferences and then subsequently smaller meetings and training sessions went incredibly well. We took people through a programme about how to enter a conversation, how to steer a conversation, how to use the knowledge that we've been able to give them through the training sessions that we've done with them in a constructive way, in a very positive way. It's very similar to the sort of this coffee discussions, the coffee dialogue you were talking about. How do we have that conversation? How do you even start a conversation in a workplace? You can't just shuffle up next to someone and say, I want to talk to you about the far right or racism or the EDL in the community or whatever. How do you start that conversation? What triggers that conversation? How do you steer it? How do you exit it if it's not going very well? How do you protect yourself in that conversation? How do we address online abuse? I send my solidarity to Paul regularly. Anybody that's suffered that level of abuse, and there are hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, of course, that are abused. Not as in the way that you're abused, but absolutely that use of the evils of social media and the way in which it's used to abuse and undermine people is quite disgraceful. So that whole programme has now run out into a joint programme with many employers. We've developed a charter, a Unity Over Division charter, that many employers, local authorities, private companies have signed up to now, so that our shop stewards and our activists go on joint training with their managers and others that they want to put forward to run a joint team inside a workplace, to be able to develop a programme for our workplaces. And it's run incredibly well. It's been incredibly successful. Opening dialogue, people being more confident about having a discussion, whether that's canteens have been closed for the last year in the main, but whether it's been in a collective environment or whether it's just been a one-to-one conversation. It's been an engaging, sort of cooperative movement, really, that's tried to bring people together. We've resourced it. I think it's been incredibly successful up until this point. As we now come from COVID, it will become more successful again. And I didn't even know that I was picking up on some of the themes that you were coming out from an academic point of view. I mean, I didn't come to it from an academic point of view. I came from it as a working class South Londoner from the Elephant and Castle who wanted to do something about what I was facing. I wanted to just talk to people. I wanted to meet people. I wanted to understand people. And that's what we did. We did Unity Over Division, and that now is a programme that's extended into our Uniting Schools work, and we're the only union actually, but we do run a schools programme, and we go in and we talk about our values to young people. Not trade union values, but our values in the context of being a young person. And we have young people that do it. And it's incredibly important, and they are values of solidarity and justice and fairness and equity. And we run a programme and case studies and role plays, and we've done a number of films, short videos, that young people find really engaging. And it takes our message into those schools. We've also done some work with Ros Wynne-Jones in Germany on the same programme. They had a problem with the AfD, the far right in Germany, of course, entering into their workplaces, particularly in the motor industry, and using co-determination of works councils and the rights for workers to elect workers to represent them, not unions. The works councils are not automatically filled by trade unionists. The fact that we happen to win most elections is neither here nor there. But the AfD were trying to win those elections by spouting hate and division and populist messages and opportunity, everything that was happening in the community, they would take it into the workplace in order to try and win some of those elections, and therefore become the representatives of workers in BMW and Volkswagen and Siemens and big corporations. And so we worked with Ros Wynne-Jones and the employers actually to make sure that didn't happen. And it's been a really successful programme across our nation, so not just here. So it is about working class people for me. It's about working class values. It's about them, the values of solidarity, justice, equity, natural justice. It's about us having a conversation with people and not assuming that people hold prejudices for any other reason than their life experiences forces them to want to find answers to things. The far right will give very opportunist answers. What we need to do is peel the onion. We need to peel away all those that surround the very hard-nosed individuals that are organising all of this. We'll deal with them in a different way. I find it very difficult to go around and have a cup of coffee with some of the people I know. I would be the person who'd come around with my mates that she was saying somebody expected her to do. But the reality is there are thousands and thousands of people that are bought into the narrative that don't really understand the narrative but feel that there's an answer to the problem that they've got in the narrative or the group that's purporting to represent their interests. And we need to peel them away. And that's not going to happen if we just simply stand on the sidelines of a demonstration and accuse them all of being racist or fascist. And that's the point, I can't remember who made the point, that nobody who's accused of being a fascist ever changes from being a fascist. You don't change a racist by calling them a racist. You've got to have a discussion with them. And I think that there are the vast majority actually that are aligned to some of these groups, some in a direct way, some in an indirect way, that we can peel off. And we have a duty to do that as trade unionists. And that's why we developed our Unity Over Division programme. That's why we're doing what we're doing as part of our work, because I see that as being a fundamentally important element of our work as a trade union. And I'll leave it there.
So normally we'd have a bit of a Q&A, but I'm going to take the spirit of Britain's thoughts and the fact that we've overrun and just say get a drink from the back and everybody have a talk to each other.